My name is John. My tale commences during a period when everything in my life appeared to be settled. I had been wedded to Emily for 13 years. It wasn't the ideal life I had dreamt of, but I always believed I would endure it for the remainder of my days. Nevertheless, like any bond, we encountered silent crises. Over time, the chasm between Emily and me widened. I immersed myself in work while she seemed to find comfort in faith, as if each of us were erecting a barrier to shield ourselves from the other. One Sunday morning, Emily insisted that I accompany her to church. I had declined for years, but that day, for reasons unknown, I consented. Perhaps I hoped to reclaim some of the lost bond with Emily, or at least to gratify her. But as I stepped into the church, which had long been alien to me, I felt ill at ease throughout the service. I couldn't focus. My gaze drifted to the windows, the paintings on the walls, and then settled on one individual. It was a young nun seated near the altar. She wasn't the kind of beauty that would captivate you, but there was something exceptional about her, a gentleness that emanated from her eyes and her smile. I couldn't avert my gaze. After the service, Emily introduced me to the congregation, and among them was Sister Mary. When we greeted each other, I could sense the warmth in her soft voice. Oddly, when she looked at me, her gaze seemed to linger a bit longer, as if she was searching or feeling for something. I didn't understand what that sensation was, only that it left me bewildered, but I couldn't stop pondering it. That night, Mary's image lingered in my thoughts. I felt something stirring within me, not yearning but a peculiar inquisitiveness, a sense of allure that I couldn't clarify. The following week, I returned to church, this time under the pretense of backing Emily, but truly, I just yearned to see Mary again. And when the priest requested volunteers to aid with church repairs, I enlisted even though I had never been keen on such tasks before. The first day I arrived to assist, I found Mary awaiting outside the church with a small toolkit in her arms. "Thank you for coming," she said, her smile as gentle as the first time we met. We began working on mending an old bench. Initially, everything revolved around casual anecdotes, my occupation, her days before she joined the religious life. But gradually, I realized that Mary possessed an intellect and wit that I had never envisioned in a nun. She spoke about her affection for art and literature, about the things she had relinquished when she chose her current path. I shared with her about my work, about how I designed structures to breathe new life into old things, and in that moment, I seemed to perceive myself, a part of me that had been overlooked, buried in the chaos and weariness of daily life. We labored all afternoon, occasionally erupting into laughter at innocuous jokes. It had been a long while since I had felt myself laughing so unreservedly. When I departed, the feeling of relief lingered, along with a longing I couldn't deny. I desired to see her again. In the ensuing weeks, I kept discovering reasons to return to the church, a pew that required fixing, a wall that needed repainting. Mary and I started to spend more time together. Initially, we conversed about work, but gradually we opened up. She confided that she sometimes felt uncertain about the path she had chosen, about the constraints of her vows. I spoke about the void in my marriage, though I deliberately omitted Emily from the discussion. It was as if an invisible thread was pulling us closer together, a bond that neither of us dared to acknowledge, but every glance, every smile hinted otherwise. My heart began to brim with emotions I dared not identify, but I knew whatever it was, it had breached the safe boundary between us. My visits with Mary became more frequent, and the connection between us seemed inescapable. I assured myself that this relationship was still pure, that I was merely seeking someone to share the feelings that I couldn't express to Emily. But Mary's every look, every smile was like a small flame kindling, the self-restraint that I attempted to maintain. One afternoon, as we painted the fence behind the church, the ambience was different. The soft sunlight filtered through the trees, and there was an eerie stillness. I recall discussing the hardships of our marriage, the feeling of desertion, the growing alienation between Emily and me. "She seems to live solely for her faith," I sighed, gazing at my hands gripping the paintbrush. "Sometimes I ponder if she even notices me." Mary set down her paintbrush, her eyes gleaming with an understanding that I couldn't turn away from. "I comprehend how it feels," she said, her voice soft but weighty. "There are days when I question if I've chosen the right path. Faith is everything to me, but sometimes I feel lonely." Her words were like a key that unlocked a door we both attempted to keep shut between two solitary souls. Empathy became a thread that bound us together. I couldn't cease thinking about her, and every time I gazed into those eyes, I realized I was edging closer to the perilous boundary. One rainy afternoon, while I was repairing the old door in the church, Mary brought me a cup of tea. We sat together. The steady sound of rain outside made the space even more tranquil. Initially, the conversation was merely about daily tasks, but gradually things deepened. "I used to believe that by taking this path, I would find absolute tranquility," Mary said, her eyes gazing out the window. "But it turns out people don't easily relinquish the desires and conflicts in their hearts." I couldn't refrain from saying, "I don't understand why, but since I met you, I feel like I'm alive again. The feelings I thought I lost, you remind me of who I used to be." Our eyes met. I don't recall how I moved, but suddenly my hand grazed hers. It was a fleeting touch, but carried the weight of all the things we had left unspoken. I saw Mary quiver, but she didn't withdraw her hand. A prolonged silence enveloped us until she said softly, "John, we shouldn't do this." I released her, guilt and confusion overwhelming me. "I know," I said, my voice raspy, but I couldn't restrain myself. Mary stood up, her eyes conflicted. "You should leave," she said, her voice trembling. I couldn't help but rise and depart, but my steps were heavy. That night, I lay awake, sensing her warmth lingering in my hands, even though I was aware that this relationship was heading towards a place neither of us should be. I couldn't halt it. She had become embedded in my thoughts, a small ember that kept burning, pushing me towards the precipice, and each time we met, the line between right and wrong grew more indistinct. Following that rainy afternoon, Mary and I attempted to maintain our distance. We both recognized that the feelings growing between us were inappropriate, that neither of us could continue down this path without losing something precious. But Mary's presence, her eyes, her voice were all like an invitation I couldn't disregard. I started appearing at church more frequently, always finding excuses for needing help with projects, but the truth was, I simply wanted to be near her. Those brief moments when we worked together, shared small stories, or merely exchanged glances seemed to breathe new life into me, and I knew she felt the same, though we never voiced it. The times we accidentally brushed hands while reaching for tools, the furtive glances that lasted longer than necessary, all of them were like wind fanning the flames we tried to suppress, but that closeness only made the distance we attempted to build more fragile. Emily began to notice the change in me, although I always tried to maintain a normal demeanor. The truth was that I was no longer the husband she knew. I became aloof, often returned home late, and no longer shared stories of my life with her as I had before. But Emily, being a perceptive person, did not easily overlook those signs. One evening when I returned home from a long day at church, Emily was waiting for me in the living room. Her eyes were stern, but not with anger, but with a quiet pain that made it impossible for me to look at her. "John," she said, her voice soft but certain, "there's something you've been concealing from me lately, isn't there?" I fumbled, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. "It's nothing, Emily," I replied, but even I didn't believe my own words. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You're different. I don't know what you're thinking, but I feel like you're not here with me, with this family." Her voice was tight, but she didn't shed a tear. "If there's anything, please tell me. Don't leave me guessing, hurting myself." I didn't know how to respond. How could I reveal the truth that I didn't dare face myself? I just nodded silently, avoiding her gaze, and went into the room, leaving Emily alone in her sorrowful space. But my silence didn't ease Emily's suspicions. She began to observe me more, noticing small details that I thought no one else would notice before. The times I looked at my phone for too long, the times I returned with an averted gaze, Gradually, I felt the distance between us growing, not only because of the things I was hiding, but also because of our inability to mend this relationship. Meanwhile, the relationship between Mary and I became increasingly ambiguous, although we tried to maintain a normal appearance. Every time we were together, the feeling of attraction became more and more obvious. One afternoon, as we were both packing for a charity event at church, I couldn't keep quiet any longer. "Mary," I said, my voice low but firm. She stopped, looking at me strangely. "We can't go on like this. Can't you see things aren't right? But they can't stop." Mary sighed softly, her eyes shining with deep sadness. "John, I know, but we have to stop. This will destroy us both." But her words did nothing to ease the wave of emotion that was surging through me. "You say that, but I know you feel the same way. You can't deny it." I looked straight into her eyes as if to admit it. Mary bowed her head, her hands clutching the towel she held. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice breaking. "I pray, John. I pray for strength, but every time I see you, it gets harder." In that moment, I realized that we had both crossed a threshold from which there was no turning back, but I also knew that if we continued, it would all come crashing down, not just for me, but for Mary as well. This conflict extended beyond my mind and into every aspect of my life. Emily grew distant while Mary felt increasingly pressured by her vows. I knew that things were on the verge of collapse, but I didn't know how to stop it. We were both on a path that we both knew would lead to the abyss. I didn't know how to escape the spiral that was engulfing me, and things only got worse. Emily, sensitive as she was, began to ask more questions. She stopped believing my vague explanations of busy work schedules and unexpected projects. Meanwhile, Mary was becoming increasingly insecure. She tried to keep her distance, but the bond between us overcame all efforts at self-control. One evening when I returned home late from a church meeting, Emily was waiting in the living room. Her eyes were sharp as knives, but there was a pain in them that I couldn't face. "John," she said, her voice eerily calm, "you think I don't know? You think I don't notice the changes in you?" I stood there frozen in place. My throat was dry, and I couldn't get the words out. Emily stood up and walked over to me. "I know you're hiding something. You're not the man I married. You're lying to me, aren't you?" Her voice was shaky, her eyes were teary, but held a firmness that made me feel choked. "Emily, I hesitated, unable to find a way to tell the truth without hurting her more. "Don't lie to me, John," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I've seen you go to church many times, but not for me, not for the faith. It's for her, right? Mary." Mary's name rang out in the room like a wake-up call. I bowed my head, unable to meet Emily's eyes. "I didn't want this to happen," I said, my voice filled with despair. "I didn't know it would go this far." Emily stood still for a moment, then smiled faintly, a bitter smile. "Don't you know? Don't you know that you've destroyed everything we had? Or do you just not care anymore?" Guilt flooded through me. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emily, but Mary, she made me feel alive again." I didn't know what to do. Emily stepped back, her eyes red. "What about me, John? What about what we built together? Isn't that enough to make you feel alive?" I kept quiet because I knew she was right. I had destroyed everything we had built together because of emotions I couldn't control. Meanwhile, Mary was facing increasing pressure at the church. The scrutiny and whispers made her feel more and more suffocated. One day, she received a letter from the church asking her to meet with the abbess to clarify the rumors surrounding our relationship. The meeting with the abbess was a humiliating experience for Mary. The abbess, a stern but compassionate woman, looked at her with disappointment. "Sister Mary," she said, her voice heavy, "you have broken the sacred vows you made before God. You have not only hurt yourself, but you have hurt this community." Mary bowed her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, Abbess," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't know it would get this far. I never meant to hurt anyone." The abbess sighed, her eyes shining with sympathy, but not lessening in severity. "You have two choices, Sister Mary. Either beg for forgiveness and submit to discipline, or leave this church forever." Mary returned to her room devastated, the abbess's words echoing in her head, making her feel as if she had lost everything, her faith, her vows, and herself. Meanwhile, news of Mary and I's relationship had begun to spread at work. I was shunned by my colleagues, and clients were slowly pulling away. I had gone from a respected architect to the target of gossip and scorn. At home, Emily filed for divorce. She no longer wanted to stay in a marriage where trust had been destroyed. "You made your choice, John," she said coldly when I begged for a chance to make amends.
But it wasn't me.
I had nothing left, no one left. Mary, too, was teetering on the brink of losing everything. We were both ensnared in a tempest of our own creation, and now there was no escape. With each passing day, I understood more and more that my poor decisions had demolished my entire life. The whole world seemed to be crumbling around Mary and me. After Emily departed, the house felt vacant, not only because of her absence but also because of the sense of loss I could not deny. Even though I knew I was wrong, I couldn't stop thinking about Mary, but I also knew that this relationship had brought nothing but anguish to both of us. Mary, after conferring with the abbess, decided to depart from the church. She couldn't endure the stern gazes of her colleagues, nor the weight of feeling betrayed by her sacred vows. She gathered her belongings and relocated to a small town where no one knew her to begin anew. Before she left, I saw her one last time in a deserted park outside the city. We sat across from each other on an old wooden bench, so quiet that I could hear the leaves rustling in the breeze. "Mary, I'm sorry," I said, my voice choking. "I didn't intend for it to be like this. I never meant to hurt you." She bowed her head, her eyes sad but tearless. "Me too, John," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But we were wrong from the start. What we had wasn't love, it was escapism. We both sought something to fill the emptiness in our hearts, but ended up hurting ourselves and those around us." I looked at her, feeling my heart squeeze. "I don't know how to go on without you," I admitted, my voice shaking. "You're the only one who makes me feel alive." Mary looked straight at me, her eyes conflicted. "John, you have to move on. Not for me, but for yourself. You need to find yourself, confront what you've done. I need to too. We can't go back, and we can't continue living like this." I didn't know what to say. Her words were a painful truth that I couldn't deny. We had both crossed a line of no return, and now the consequences were unavoidable. Mary stood up, her small shoulders shaking in the wind. "Goodbye, John," she said, her voice breaking. "Be good and forgive yourself." I watched her walk away, feeling like my world had collapsed in that moment. That was the last time I saw Mary. In the months that followed, I was filled with emptiness and remorse. Emily was officially divorced, taking with her the past and the cherished memories of the marriage I had ruined. I tried to focus on work, but the respect of my colleagues and clients had vanished. I was compelled to leave the company and start over, this time in a lower position, not as prestigious as before. Mary, I heard from old acquaintances, had found a job in a small bookstore in the new city. She lived quietly, did not interact much with anyone, and spent most of her time in prayer and contemplation. Although she had left the church, she still kept the habit of attending Mass every week, hoping to find peace in her heart. One day, when I entered a small cafe on a business trip, I suddenly saw her. Mary was sitting alone near the window, reading a book with the afternoon sun shining on her gentle but thoughtful face. My heart stopped for a moment. She also saw me, and for a moment our eyes met, but instead of approaching, we both turned away as if silence was the only answer we could give each other. Even without saying anything, I knew that the memories of this relationship would always be a part of us, a painful part, but also an unforgettable lesson. The mistakes had destroyed the life we knew, but also forced us to face ourselves and find a way to rebuild from the broken pieces. Mary and I both knew that love, while once brilliant, was also a fire that consumed everything, and now all that was left were ashes, traces of a story that we would both carry for the rest of our lives. Looking back on everything that had happened, I realized that I had let my fleeting emotions cloud my judgment. I had been wrong not to confront the problems in my marriage, but to seek solace from someone else. I had thought that the feeling of life that Mary brought would fill the void in my heart, but in reality, it had only pushed me deeper into chaos and loss. That ill-fated relationship not only made me lose my family, but also hurt the person I thought I loved. It was not true love, but just an escape from unresolved issues. I understand that love is not about finding someone to fill the void, but about facing and building from the difficulties you encounter. If you feel lonely or unhappy in your relationship, learn to face and talk openly with your partner. Don't let the distance linger, because it will open the door for emotions that are out of control. Sometimes what we really need is not a new person, but understanding and reconnecting with the person we have been with for many years. Don't let temporary emotions trade off the value of what you have tried to build. Every choice you make affects not only yourself, but also those who love you. Always remember, true love requires patience, forgiveness, and a foundation of loyalty.